Dear students, welcome to this session on literary criticism. Today we will have an introduction to the Victorian age and will discuss an extract from The Study of Poetry by the famous Victorian poet Mathew Arnold. The Victorian age from 1837 to 1901. This age is the reign of Queen Victoria. It was a prosperous period marked by industrial development and colonial expansion. Generally, it is said to be an age of reforms. People could witness the advancement of science. And as we all know, there was a big conflict between science and religion. Many strong religious beliefs and the biblical story of creation were all questioned, and everything got subverted, and people were in a dilemma what to believe in, where to belong to. So all these were the features of the Victorian age. And in the year 1859, Charles Darwin published his The Origin of Species and proposed the theory of evolution, and basically it questions God and thus fueled up the conflict between science and religion. So all these complex social situations get well reflected in the literary works of the era. On the slide you can find the names of a few major poets of Victorian age, namely Alfred Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning, Christina Rossetti, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Mathew Arnold, and there were many other poets too. I hope you have learned a poetic piece by Robert Browning, and you might have come across the type of poetry called dramatic monologue. Dramatic monologue is a kind of poem in which we find a speaker and an implied listener. There is a person, the presence of a person who listens, but this listener does not interfere at all. Okay, you will be dealing with that in detail in other subjects. The major essays of the period: Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, Walter Pater, Mathew Arnold. Major novelists: Thackeray, Charles Dickens, George Eliot, and Bronte sisters, Emily Bronte, Charlotte Bronte. Here you can see Mathew Arnold, the British poet and critic, son of Thomas Arnold, who was the headmaster of Rugby School. You can have a look at the major literary works of Mathew Arnold. You should learn them. Now let us come to our lesson, The Study of Poetry. You have only a short portion from this work. This essay was published as the introduction to T.H. Ward's anthology, The English Poets. Later, it appeared in Essays in Criticism, second series. Mathew Arnold believed that poetry should uplift people and console them. Arnold is championing poetry here. He is glorifying poetry, and he is concerned with the high destiny of poetry. Arnold makes a few remarks about the future of poetry. He believes that poetry has a vast and immense future. Poetry should not be belittled or underestimated. Poetry is a discipline which is worthy of high destinies. And in poetry, our human race will find a surer stay. All other disciplines and dogmas seem to be questionable and subject to threat, whereas in poetry, idea is everything. The rest is a world of divine illusion only. In his act of glorifying poetry, Arnold is pointing out the limitations of religion, philosophy, science, and so on. According to Arnold, our religion has materialized itself in the fact, that is, it has got materialized in the supposed fact. So all the religious sentiments are attached to certain facts, but these facts are failing religion and the human race. We are witnessing so many controversies today based on religion and religious practices, and it's very easy for us to understand. Religion parades evidences and the popular minds rely on them. After all, it's a false show of knowledge. We cannot depend on religion anymore. Mathew Arnold also points out the emptiness of philosophy, or the hollow nature of philosophy. He says poetry is the only solace for human race, and we cannot rely upon philosophy anymore, because philosophy is pluming on its reasoning about causation. That is, it's in a complacent state, thinking about causation, the cause and effect of things, about the finite and the infinite nature of being, and so on. Philosophy can be said to be a mere shadow of knowledge. So we cannot depend on philosophy as a reliable source anymore. Let us see how Arnold connects poetry and science. He says that without poetry, our science will appear incomplete. According to him, very soon poetry will replace religion and science. People will turn to poetry, which will help us to interpret life for us, which will help us to get consoled, which will help us to sustain ourselves on this earth. And he also quotes Wordsworth, "Poetry is the breath and finer spirit of all knowledge." Arnold states that we are all invited to trace the stream of English poetry. It's a mighty river of poetry, a great contributory stream to the world. And when we try to know this mighty river of poetry, the thoughts that govern us should be the same. Our thoughts about poetry should be consistent and firm. We should consider poetry as a worthy entity. It's not just a mere sort of entertainment. It should be considered much more highly than ever. Poetry is capable of higher uses. It is meant for higher destinies. People will soon turn to poetry for consolation. And we should set a standard for poetry. We should listen and enjoy poetry of a higher order of excellence. And one should exercise strict judgment with regard to poetry. Let us now see what Arnold said about charlatanism. A charlatan is a person practicing quackery or dishonest practices, that is, deception in order to obtain money, fame, or other advantages via some form of pretense or deception. He claims to have special knowledge and skill in some field, especially that of medicine. So in poetry, charlatanism refers to confusing and obliterating the distinction between excellent and inferior, sound and unsound, or even half sound, true and untrue, or even half true, which means the readers will not be able to judge or come to a conclusion whether that is really excellent or an inferior kind of poetry, whether this poetry is true and sound or is it untrue or what. So kind of a confusion created by a tendency called charlatanism. According to Arnold, charlatanism shall find no entrance in poetry. Such kind of deceptions or pseudo things will never happen in poetry. It's because poetry is called for higher destinies. Poetry is a noble sphere where thought and art are rolled into one. It's kept inviolate and inviolable. In poetry, the distinction between excellent and inferior, sound and unsound, true and untrue is of paramount importance. So there is no scope for charlatanism in poetry according to Arnold. Arnold believed that the best poetry will be found to have a power of forming, sustaining, and delighting us. And he says, our estimate of what we read should be governed by a sense for the best, a sense for the really excellent. This is how we should approach a poetic piece. We should focus on the strength and joy to be drawn from the best poetry. Arnold says that while judging poetry, we may commit some mistakes or some fallacies may happen. This may be historic fallacy or historic estimate, or a fallacy based on a personal estimate. A poet or a poem may count to us historically. That is, the course of development of a nation's language, thought and poetry is profoundly interesting. By regarding a poet's work as a stage in this course of development, we may bring ourselves to make it of importance as poetry than in itself it really is. So we may overrate it, and our poetic judgments come up from that. So this would end up in a fallacy which we may call historic. Again, the second one is personal estimate, fallacy based on personal estimate. A poet or a poem may count us on grounds personal to ourselves. Our personal affinities, likings and circumstances have great power to sway our estimate of a poet's work. So this is called a fallacy based on personal estimate.